In this video, I would like to discuss the concepts of necessary and sufficient conditions with the help of these three images, along with a couple others. Before I go any further, I should answer the question that is probably on your mind. Why am I bringing this up? In our daily lives, people may confuse what is necessary with what is sufficient and vice versa. For example, people may confuse what is necessary for being successful in life with what is sufficient for being successful in life and vice versa. In other words, they may think something that is necessary is enough for a thing to be true, or that something that is sufficient is required for a thing to be true. Think about your own life. How many times have you or others believed that something that is necessary is sufficient for something, or that what is sufficient is necessary for something? This is where knowing the distinction between the two can help one not make the mistake of misidentifying them. Not to mention, knowing the distinction can help you analyze and determine what would be a good meaning for a given concept, such as being successful. With that said, let's get on with discussing what the terms necessary and sufficient mean. Let's start by discussing what necessary means. When we say something is necessary for something else, we mean that this other thing cannot be true without the necessary thing being true. For example, being a mammal is a necessary condition for being a cat. In other words, being a cat cannot be true without being a mammal. Symbolically, I could say the following by using the letter P to represent being a mammal and Q to represent being a cat. If P isn't true, then Q isn't true. Given this, one could say that if P is necessary for Q, then Q cannot be true unless P is true. A question one could ask themselves is this: is it impossible to have Q without P? If the answer is yes, then P is necessary. If not, then P is not necessary. Moving on, let's now discuss what sufficient means. When we say something is sufficient for something else, we mean that this other thing is true when the sufficient thing is true. For example, being a dog is a sufficient condition for being a mammal. In other words, being a dog is enough to make being a mammal true. Symbolically, I could say the following by using the letter P to represent being a dog and Q to represent being a mammal. If P is true, then Q is true. Given this, one could say that if P is sufficient for Q, then P being true is enough to make Q true. A question one could ask themselves is this: does the presence of P guarantee the presence of Q? If the answer is yes, then P is sufficient. If not, then P is not sufficient. On the topic of sufficient, sometimes one condition by itself isn't sufficient, but when paired together with other conditions, they together become sufficient. For example, flour by itself isn't sufficient for a birthday cake, but when paired together with other things, they together become sufficient for a birthday cake. This is called being jointly sufficient. Now, I would like to go back to what I talked about at the beginning of the video, where I said that in our daily lives, people may confuse what is necessary with what is sufficient and vice versa. Here is a tabular way to help avoid confusion. Starting off with remembering that a condition can be necessary but not sufficient. For example, being a mammal is a necessary condition for being a cat, but it isn't sufficient, as something could be a mammal and yet not be a cat, such as being a dog. The take-home message about this is that a necessary condition is required for a statement to be true, but does not guarantee that statement to be true. Also, a condition can be sufficient but not necessary. For example, being a cat is a sufficient condition for being a mammal, but it isn't necessary, as something could be a mammal and yet not be a cat, such as being a dog. The take-home message about this is that a sufficient condition guarantees a statement to be true, but is not required for that statement to be true. Not to mention, a condition can be both necessary and sufficient. For example, being a male sibling is both necessary and sufficient for being a brother. The take-home message about this is that sometimes a condition can be both necessary and sufficient. Finally, a condition can be neither necessary nor sufficient. For example, being an insect is neither necessary nor sufficient for being a mammal. The take-home message about this is that sometimes a condition can be neither necessary nor sufficient. Now, from all of this, here are some important points I would like to highlight. As seen previously, please remember that necessary and sufficient are not the same. It is possible for a condition to have only one, both, or neither trait. As a side, you may have noticed a relationship between necessary and sufficient. Saying P is necessary for Q also means that Q is sufficient for P, and saying P is sufficient for Q also means Q is necessary for P. Also, it can be easy to find objections to some of these conditions if everything isn't spelled out. For example, in the birthday cake example, we usually assume, amongst other things, that there is someone or something present to mix the ingredients. This is where you should be aware of any obvious, unstated background assumptions when analyzing and determining conditions. With that all said, make sure to correctly identify what is necessary and what is sufficient, and remember to take care and think critically.